us to drive in our time machine to a point of exactly 50 years ago, as on December 10, 1975, a major event took place in the capital of Norway. On that day, the first ever Russian winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Andrei Sakharov, was supposed to receive it in person, but of course the Soviet government would not allow him to leave the country, and instead on that day he was in the city of Vilnius, standing in front of the courthouse, where his friend and fellow activist Sergei Kovalyov was being tried for anti-Soviet activities, while Sakharov was denied entry to the hearings. But Sakharov's wife, and a heroic figure in her own right, Elena Bonner, whom I was fortunate to meet probably twice in my life, but my mother knew her better. Elena Bonner was able to get abroad for medical reasons, so she accepted the prize on her husband's behalf and delivered his Nobel lecture. And let us watch and listen for a couple of minutes to grasp the depth of that abyss which separates the world that could and should have been from the one where we have ended up after all the missed opportunities of the past 50 years.
Что защита прав человека обеспечивает надежное основание для подлинного и долговечного международного сотрудничества.
Мы закончили эту нашу специальную передачу. Итак, актовый зал Московского университета.
Уважаемые члены Нобелевского комитета, глубоко уважаемые дамы и господа, мир, прогресс, права человека — эти три цели неразрывно связаны. Нельзя достигнуть какой-либо одной из них, пренебрегая другими. Такова главная мысль, которую я хочу отметить в этой лекции. Я глубоко благодарен за присуждение мне высокой, волнующей награды Нобелевской премии мира и за предоставленную возможность выступить сегодня перед вами. Я с особенным удовлетворением воспринял формулировку комитета, в которой подчеркнута роль защиты прав человека как единственного прочного основания для подлинного и долговечного международного сотрудничества. Эта мысль кажется мне очень важной. Я убежден, что международное доверие, взаимопонимание, разоружение и международная безопасность немыслимы без открытости общества, свободы информации, свободы убеждений, гласности, свободы поездок и выбора страны проживания. Я убежден также, что свобода убеждений наряду с другими гражданскими свободами является основой научно-технического прогресса и гарантией от использования его достижений во вред человечеству, тем самым основой экономического и социального прогресса, а также является политической гарантией возможности эффективной защиты социальных прав. Таким образом, я защищаю тезис о первичном, определяющем значении гражданских и политических прав в формировании судеб человечества.
We'll stop at this, and I think some of this is the gist of what we'll be talking today, even though it was 50 years ago. And I urge us all to think how many layers of human progress envisioned in Sakharov's words, and by the movement he led, were seemingly achieved for so many with the end of the Cold War, and then abruptly discarded. First in Russia, and now, alas, in this country as well. International cooperation these days is more often about joint violations of human rights than about defending them. The freedom of belief is under assault by the purveyors of one and only correct ideology that back 25 years ago was called market fundamentalism. The late Peter Redaway and I defined it in our joint work as market socialism. Now, anybody that disagrees with it is the enemy and the suspect. There is no longer the freedom to believe in anti-fascist ideas, because this administration has criminalized anti-fascism, in spite of the fact that the United States was an Antifa country, a member of the anti-fascist coalition in World War II. I have never called and would never support any violence anywhere. But if any political label can be put on yours truly, I'm an anti-fascist, and I'm putting this on record. Sakharov's words about the freedom to choose one's country of residence would surely qualify under today's political climate as extremism on migration, quote from the recent presidential statement. Even though the freedom that Sakharov spoke about was the driving force of progress in modern times, as mass immigration has often forced the countries of origin to reform their political and economic system. Now, we are of course a bunch of humble non-profits with minimal or no material resources. We never support or oppose any candidates for office, and will not do so in the future. Yet we cannot and should not abstain from supporting or opposing ideas and policies, especially as dangerous and as lethal as the ones that we encounter these days, that coming from the government now. We are small people in a vulnerable and largely neglected community with not much power, but the question is, shall we allow ourselves to be frozen by fear and be led toward autocracy and lawlessness like cattle to the slaughter? Or should we make a moral choice to speak up and take the risks, at the very least, to make our views known? And I think that's what the first part of our meeting today is all about. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Tatiana Yankelevich, the co-founder and co-chair of our association's board, former director of the Sakharov program at Harvard, and last but far from the least, the daughter of Elena Bonham, whom you have just heard.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, and good evening to everyone. I want to start by telling you that I want to begin with a few dates. One date that preceded what was shown right now on the screen, preceded the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony by some 10 years and 5 days. On December 5, 1965, glasnost rally, meeting glasnosti in Pushkin Square in Moscow. That was the starting point of the human rights movement in the Soviet Union. December 10, 1975 was the ceremony in which Nobel Peace Prize was bestowed on Andrei Sakharov. Sakharov at that time said that he shares it with all prisoners of conscience, all political prisoners of the Soviet Union. On December 8, 1986, just a little bit over 10 years later, Anatoli Marchenko died in Chistopol Prison. He was on hunger strike for 117 days since August 1986, demanding amnesty for all political prisoners. He was 48 years old. A worker by trade, a writer and human rights activist by vocation, in my testimony, a 1967 book smuggled from the Soviet Union, Anatoli Marchenko brought to light the horrific jail conditions of political prisoners, providing the first glimpse of Soviet political camps of the post-Lenin and post-Stalin era. Anatoli Marchenko was the only person nominated by Andrei Sakharov himself for the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought of the European Parliament. Anatoly became a laureate posthumously 2 years after he passed away in Chistopol Prison in 1988. But a year earlier, almost exactly, on September 4th, 1985, Vasily Stus, the genius of Ukrainian poetry and literature, died in the Soviet forced labor camp after a prolonged hunger strike. Ukrainian poet nominated for Nobel Prize in Literature and an active member of Ukrainian human rights movement spent 13 years in a Soviet forced labor camp for political prisoners. And another date, which is coming very soon, December 14th, 1989, Andrei Sakharov passed away. These are the mournful dates of sorrow for all who cherish life and liberty. It seemed after Sakharov's passing, and especially after Anatoly Marchenko died, that the political course of the Soviet Union associated with total control had changed forever, and that the state was ready for some kind of democracy. Now, 40 years later, today, most post-Soviet states are experiencing, and above all, Russia, are experiencing a new period of radical, brutal suppression of dissent. Currently, at least 1,700 people have been convicted and imprisoned in Russia for political reasons. 1,200 in Belarus and about 400 in Azerbaijan. All prisoners of conscience are held in conditions incomparably harsher than in the times of Marchenko, Stus, or Sakharov. The first sign of fascism, according to the definition of the Russian Academy of Sciences, goes as follows. Fascism is an ideology and practice that asserts the superiority and exceptionalism of a particular nation or race aimed at inciting national intolerance. The West ignored, failed to recognize, or overlooked the bifurcation points in the direction of the fascization of Russian Federation and the creation of the so-called Russian world. In most cases, the West ignored these moments, wishing to preserve its comfortable existence. But if we look deeper, this is the result of consequence of the sadly widespread misconception, the myth of Russia's exceptionalism and its historical path. The myth only contributes to strengthening xenophobic, anti-democratic, populist concepts in the public consciousness, both in Russia and in the West. Concepts that are beneficial to criminal dictators like Putin and those who would like to be like him. This myth also contributes to the spread of cynicism, opportunism, and conformism, which have already played a terrible role in shaping the realpolitik, the approach of realpolitik to turning points in recent Russian history, in the favor of democratic trends and the reform process, or rather the complete destruction of the totalitarian state. Sakharov warned about the dangerous desire to preserve privileges, comfort, and one's place on the social ladder, leading to cynicism and indifference to human rights. He spoke of the Soviet state, of the Soviet servile intelligentsia, but this is equally true for European community, which for years ignored the signals coming from the Kremlin. Russia has no right to place itself above the laws of civilization, above universal human rights criteria. And as long as this continues to happen, as long as Russia abuses this exceptionalism, it will continue to pose a threat to the free world and to freedom and human rights everywhere. And it will bring destruction and death wherever it reaches, just as it is doing today in Ukraine. Ukraine that is defending its own and our freedom. Sakharov warned against, he warned about this when he spoke of the danger of closed regimes to themselves and to the outside world. Civic indifference leads to cynicism and thus allows the emergence of dictatorships, authoritarian and totalitarian regimes.